The 4:15 to Paddington departed Wharton Halt carrying in its first-class compartment a woman who was, in all probability, already dead. The guard had checked his compartment with the satisfaction of a man who has never once been wrong, and recorded the departure time with the unwavering authority of 11 years of professional habit. It was a locked carriage and a watched journey, a timeline leaving no room whatsoever for murder. Yet, at Paddington, they found her. The puzzle that defeated the police rested entirely on one invisible fact: the guard's pocket watch ran exactly 7 minutes slow. Somebody knew, and built a murder around it. Hello, friends. I'm Jack, coming to you from Ohio, and welcome back to Midnight Pages, where the fire is always lit and the mystery is always worth the wait. Tonight we are boarding a train in the English countryside, stepping onto a quiet October platform where a small mechanical flaw in one man's pocket watch is about to become the foundation of something very cold and very deliberate. Before we begin, I'd love to know, has a small discrepancy, a wrong time, a misread schedule, something that shouldn't have mattered, ever changed the course of your day in a way you didn't expect? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Now settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let us begin. Chapter 1, Wharton Halt, 4:15. The station at Wharton Halt was not, by any measure, a place of distinction. It possessed 2 platforms, a signal box that had been painted green some years ago and was now a sort of resigned sage, a waiting room that smelled permanently of coal dust and damp wool, and a tea room that served excellent tea in thick white cups and very good scones, and was run by a widow named Ellen Tripp who had been at Wharton Halt long enough to know the regular passengers by sight, by luggage, and in several cases by the particular quality of their impatience. In late October, the afternoon light arrived at an angle that gave everything: the platform benches, the timetable board, the pigeons on the signal gantry, a certain faded, melancholy beauty, as though the station were a painting rather than a working railway stop, and a painting of a somewhat earlier period at that. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the wooden bench at the far end of platform 2 with her knitting bag beside her and a half-finished sock progressing in her lap, was entirely content with all of this. She was waiting for Mrs. Winifred Hadley's nephew, who had been detailed to collect her overnight bags and who had telephoned at the last moment to say he was running a little late, owing to a difficulty with the motor. Miss Marple had said that she did not mind at all, which was perfectly true. A railway station, in her long experience, offered a more concentrated and instructive view of human nature than almost any other public space, because people at stations were never quite themselves. They were always slightly off their usual village balance, anxious or impatient or conspicuously at ease in the studied way of people who are working at it, and in either state they invariably revealed a good deal more than they intended. She was watching Guard Datchet, who stood at the midpoint of platform 1 with the settled authority of a man who considers himself the fixed center around which all railway business rotates. He was a compact person of about 55, with a rather large moustache and the general bearing of a sergeant major who had found his natural calling in the railway service. He consulted his pocket watch with the frequency of a church clock and the gravity of a Harley Street physician taking a pulse. Every 3 minutes or thereabouts, out came the watch, the lid was flicked open with a practised thumb, the face was studied with great seriousness, and the watch was returned to his waistcoat with a nod of quiet satisfaction. He had been right. He was always right. Miss Marple found this interesting, in the way she found most things interesting, without quite knowing yet what it was that interested her about it. The 4:15 arrived at Platform 1 with the hissing, groaning arrival of a train that has been performing this particular arrival for years and has not yet decided whether it finds it tedious. A scattering of passengers emerged and dispersed. A porter wheeled a trolley of mail bags. And then, Miss Marple's needle slowed almost imperceptibly. There was a commotion of a quiet sort at the base of the steps. A woman in a pale grey coat and a neatly knotted headsquare was being helped up the steps by another woman, darker and more energetically anxious, whose headsquare was tied rather more loosely and whose manner conveyed, from 30 yards, a quality of strained solicitude, the manner of someone performing concern with great effort. The pale woman, the one in grey, moved with a heaviness that had nothing to do with her luggage, which was slight. She moved as though the ordinary instructions between intention and action had been interrupted somewhere in transit. Each step was slightly too deliberate. Her head had a tendency to incline to the side that one does not choose. She leaned against her companion in the way of someone who can no longer quite manage on their own, and who has been persuaded, somehow, that what they are experiencing is merely a headache. Dorothea Ashbourne, for it was she, though Miss Marple did not know her name yet, spoke to a porter, gesturing toward the first-class carriage. The porter, a young man with a cooperative manner, stepped forward. Between them, with some considerable management, the pale woman was installed in a first-class compartment, placed against the window seat, settled, a travelling rug arranged over her lap with the fussiness of a devoted relation. Dorothea said something to the porter. She indicated the blind. The porter half lowered it. Then Dorothea stepped back onto the platform, patted her handbag, and stood in the cold air with her arms folded, watching the carriage door as though she expected it to do something surprising. She did not board the train. Guard Datchet produced his watch. He consulted it. He walked the length of his train, opening and closing each compartment door in turn with the methodical thoroughness of a man who has never yet found anything wrong with a compartment and does not expect to begin today. He reached the first-class section. He glanced in through the glass. The woman by the window appeared to be sleeping, her head rested slightly sideways against the cushion, her grey-coated shoulders quite still. He moved on. His whistle blew. The 4:15 eased forward with a long exhalation of steam and the slow, gathering confidence of a machine resuming its proper purpose. The platform slid backward. Dorothea Ashbourne stood quite still, watching it go. Then she turned and walked toward the station exit with a brisk, decided step, and disappeared. Miss Marple watched her go. She looked down at her watch, the small silver thing she wore pinned to her lapel, which she kept regulated against the wireless, and which read for 23. She looked up at the station clock above the ticket office. The black hands indicated for 22. She noted both times with the mild, automatic precision of a woman who has always found small discrepancies worth noting, without immediately knowing why. Through the glass of the tea-room, as she rose to gather her bag, she could see Ellen Tripp moving efficiently among the tables with a tray. On the corner table, the small one by the frosted lower half of the window, 2 teacups sat abandoned. One empty. The other completely full, a thin skin of cooled milk already forming across its surface. The second cup had not been touched at all. Mrs. Hadley's nephew arrived 4 minutes later, slightly breathless, and they walked to the car in the October dusk, the smell of coal smoke and fallen leaves following them off the platform. Chapter 2: What the Guard Saw. The news came the following morning with the baker's boy, who had it from the station master, who had had a telephone call from the Paddington station master at 7:15. It came down through Wharton Mead the way all news of that kind comes down through English villages, rapidly, in a widening circle, with each teller adding the particular quality of their own astonishment to it, so that by the time it reached Mrs. Hadley's dining room, where Miss Marple was eating toast and marmalade and looking at the sparrows on the garden wall, it had acquired the full weight and colour of catastrophe. A woman found dead in first class. The 4:15. Strangled. The word fell into the morning air like something dropped from a height. A woman found dead in first class. The 4:15. Evelyn Keene, née Ashbourne, of Cheltenham. Mrs. Hadley took the call in her hallway and came into the dining room with the expression of someone whose comfortable expectations of the morning have been substantially revised. She sat down. She said, "Jane, my dear, there is something rather dreadful." By 11 o'clock, Inspector Radstock of the County CID had established himself in the front room of the village constabulary and was receiving statements. He was a broad, grey-haired, deliberate man who conducted all his conversations in the manner of someone dictating to a court reporter, complete sentences, no unnecessary qualifications, a slight impatience with vagueness. He had decided opinions about trains and about time, and he had, Miss Marple noticed at once, a strong preference for facts that he could enter directly into his notebook without having to think too carefully about them. Guard Datchet was there when Miss Marple arrived to give her own statement, sitting very upright, his cap on his knee, his expression the expression of a man who expects to be central to the proceedings. He had his ledger with him. He had produced it already. The departure was at 4:15, he said, for what was evidently not the first time, with a precision that suggested he found repetition no hardship. "I have it here. I checked all compartments at Wharton Halt, as is my invariable practice. The lady in first class appeared to be resting. I saw nothing amiss." "You are quite certain of the time?" Radstock said. "I am quite certain, Inspector. I should say I am quite certain." He permitted himself a slight inflation of the chest. "I have been on the Wharton Halt service for 11 years. My record is without blemish." The 4:15 departed at 4:15, and the lady in the compartment was alive at that moment, or at the very least appeared so in every observable particular. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner with her hands folded, listened to Datchet with the attentive, mild patience she brought to conversations which interested her but which she was not yet ready to respond to. She was thinking about her own watch. She was thinking about the station clock. She was thinking about the number for 22, and the number for 23, and the number 4:15, and what the distance between them meant. She said nothing about any of this. She gave her own statement. She had been on the platform. She had seen the departure, and she thanked Inspector Radstock for his time, and she went back to Mrs. Hadley's cottage and ate lunch, and said very little about any of it over the soup. The puzzle, as Radstock had laid it out, was genuine and severe: a locked compartment, a watched journey, no possibility of boarding or exit between Wharton Halt and the intermediate stop at Thornbury Junction. The victim had been seen, by Datchet, alive at departure. She had been found, at Paddington, strangled. Nobody in a locked compartment, watched at every stop, could have killed her. It was a thing of classical and maddening impossibility. Miss Marple, sewing a button onto a blouse after luncheon, thought that the classical and maddening impossibilities were generally the ones that had the simplest explanations, and that the simplest explanations were generally the ones that everyone had assumed, without examining, to be true. Guard Datchet's watch, for instance. Everyone was assuming that 4:15 meant for 15. Chapter 3: A Very Pleasant Village. Wharton Mead in October had settled comfortably into itself, which was not quite the same as saying it was peaceful. English villages in Miss Marple's experience were rarely peaceful. They were simply expert at arranging the evidence of their turbulence below the visible surface, the way an old millpond looks completely still from above and is perpetually in motion at the bottom. The church, which was Norman at the base and Victorian everywhere above the chancel arch, stood at the centre of the village in the self-satisfied way of English village churches that have been managing perfectly well without anyone's particular attention for several centuries and intend to continue. The post office sold stamps and biscuits and this week's paper and a surprising selection of bootlaces. The Woolpack had been in need of new carpeting since the previous decade and nobody had done anything about it, which suited the regular customers perfectly. Lanes ran in all directions from the village green, sunk below the levels of the surrounding fields and overhung with elm and ash, smelling of mud and dead leaves and the particular clean sharpness of a countryside that has recently had rain. Mrs. Winifred Hadley was a woman who had lived in Wharton Mead for 40 years and had never, in all that time, found it anything less than entirely sufficient. She was small and warm and inexhaustible, with a gift for conversation that had the quality of a particularly comfortable armchair. One settled into it without noticing, and found oneself very reluctant to leave. She knew the history of every family in the village and the surrounding district, and she communicated this knowledge in a steady, cheerful, generous flow that required no more prompting than a cup of tea placed within reach and an expression of interested attention. Over the next several days, as the business of the murder occupied Radstock and his constables and the village tongues, Miss Marple learned a great deal about the Ashbournes. "Gerald is the older one," Mrs. Hadley said, walking beside her on the afternoon of the third day along the footpath that curved around the bottom of the orchard. 7 years older than Evelyn. Their father was a man of property but absolutely no financial sense, which is a combination I have always thought particularly unfortunate. He spent freely, invested badly, and died at 62, leaving things in considerably more disorder than anyone had suspected. Gerald got the Grange and the land, such as it is, and Evelyn got a small settled income and a house in Cheltenham, which I have always thought she got the better of the bargain, though she might not have seen it that way. The Grange is a beautiful house, but it costs a very great deal to keep. "And Gerald?" Miss Marple said. Gerald has been managing for years in the way that people do manage when they are too proud to say they can't manage. Selling off things quietly. Letting the South Wing. Dorothea makes the best of it. She is a capable woman, though she talks rather a great deal when she is anxious, which has always struck me as her version of keeping very still. Mrs. Hadley paused to hold a branch aside for Miss Marple. He has had some investments come off badly. The sort of thing men of his type get drawn into by other men of his type who are more confident than they are clever. It has not been easy. And now with Evelyn gone, the estate, her portion, reverts, you see. There is a provision in old Mr. Ashbourne's will. It was never expected to come into operation, but there it is. Reverts to Gerald, Miss Marple said. To Gerald, Mrs. Hadley confirmed. A considerable sum, when you add it all up. The income from the trust, the house in Cheltenham, and the insurance, which Evelyn took out when she was married to that dreadful Keene man and which her brother was always the named beneficiary of, for some reason I have never quite understood. Miss Marple thought about this. She thought about it that afternoon, sitting in Mrs. Hadley's parlour with her knitting, listening to the fire and the sound of rooks in the elms beyond the garden. She thought about a man quietly running out of money, and a settled sum that would resolve everything, and a wife who talked a great deal when she was anxious. There had been a woman in St. Mary Mead, the chemist's wife, a Mrs. Portley, who had been famous in the village for her insistence on punctuality. Her husband was to be home at 6 o'clock for his supper, and home at 6 he invariably was, to the minute, stepping through the door as their mantel clock in the hall struck the hour, never a moment late. Miss Marple had always found this slightly suspicious, not of Mr. Portley, who was a mild and harmless man, but of the clock. When young Saunders the railway porter mentioned, in all innocence at the post office, that he had seen Mr. Portley coming out of the Green Dragon at 6:15 one Monday evening, the village had reacted with the excitement of a community long starved of incident. Mrs. Portley had been furious. Mr. Portley had been bewildered. The truth, which emerged gradually and with considerable embarrassment all round, was entirely innocent. The portless mantel clock gained exactly 4 minutes every single day and had done so for as long as either of them could remember. Neither of them had ever set it against any external standard. They had simply wound it and lived by it, and their 4 minutes per day gain had accumulated, over years, into a clock that ran a full hour and 40 minutes fast, then been reset at some point nobody could precisely recall, and had gained its way forward again. On the evening in question, it was running 17 minutes fast. Mr. Portley had been home, by his own reckoning and by the reckoning of his domestic arrangements, at 6 o'clock precisely, and had been at the Green Dragon from what he believed was 5:40 to what he believed was 5:45. He was not wrong. He was simply living by the wrong clock, and had been for years, with perfect sincerity. Miss Marple had found this a very instructive example at the time. She found it even more instructive now, sitting in Mrs. Hadley's parlour with her knitting and thinking about a railway guard's pocket watch. Chapter 4: The Grey Coat at Thornbury. Radstock came on the Thursday morning, which was grey and damp, with a northwest wind that rattled the leaves along the lane and suggested that autumn had made its decision about the matter and was not going to be argued with. he sat in Mrs. Hadley's front parlour and accepted tea, which Mrs. Hadley brought in with the cheerful efficiency of a woman for whom hospitality is a form of intelligence gathering, and he told Miss Marple, without precisely asking her opinion, what he had discovered at Thornbury Junction. A platform porter named Fellows, reliable man, 18 years on the station, commended twice by the station-master, had come forward 3 days after the murder to say that he had seen a woman in a distinctive pale grey coat and a pale head square disembark from the 4:15 when it stopped at Thornbury on the afternoon in question. She had moved, he said, quickly, briskly, toward the main exit. He had not seen her face. He remembered the coat clearly because it was an unusual shade, almost silver in the platform lighting, and because a woman moving that briskly in first-class clothes was, in his experience, generally in a hurry to meet someone. "This shifts everything," Radstock said, with the satisfaction of a man whose theory has been confirmed in a direction he had not entirely anticipated but finds useful nonetheless. If the woman was alive and mobile at Thornbury, getting off the train under her own steam, then the murder cannot have occurred before Thornbury. It occurred afterward. Between Thornbury and Paddington. Miss Marple, who had been listening with her hands folded and her expression perfectly neutral, said, "And what time does the porter say she disembarked?" 5:05. By the platform clock at Thornbury Junction. 5:05, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "And the train arrives at Thornbury at 5:02, by the timetable. Departs 5:12. So she was seen disembarking at 5:05. After a 3-minute stop. She considered. And the porter identified her as Mrs. Keene herself. Radstock hesitated, briefly. He identified the grey coat. He saw her from behind, in motion. He did not see her face. "I see," said Miss Marple pleasantly. There was also the matter of Percival Crisp. Radstock produced this fact with the air of a man placing a trump card. Crisp was the vicar's son, 35, unmarried, something in local insurance, known to have borrowed money from the late Mrs. Keene some 2 years previously and to have been, according to at least 2 reliable sources, somewhat dilatory about repaying it. He had been seen at the Thornbury Junction ticket office on Monday afternoon, at approximately 5:05, purchasing a return to Paddington. He had been notably agitated. He had asked the clerk, twice, whether the 4:15 from Wharton Halt had already arrived. He was on the train, Radstock said. He had motive. He had the opportunity to board at Thornbury, and his behaviour at the ticket window was, by the clerk's account, that of a man under considerable strain. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I can see why that would look very interesting." After Radstock had gone, she sat for a while looking at the rain on the window glass, which ran in long, crooked rivulets that reached the sill and collected in the groove and dripped. She liked rain on windows. It was meditative. It gave the mind something to follow while it worked on something else. She was working on Dorothea Ashbourne, specifically. She was working on what it would take for a woman to sit for 40 minutes in a railway compartment beside a person she had killed, whether she had felt anything, whether she had looked at her, whether the 40 minutes had been a long time or a short one. She thought they had probably been both. She thought Dorothea was a woman for whom things were simultaneously much shorter and much longer than they appeared, because the mind, when it is doing something it knows to be terrible, does not behave on ordinary time. The grey coat. The head square. The practice step onto the Thornbury platform. These required a specific quality of cold nerve that Miss Marple had encountered before, in other drawing rooms, in other investigations, and which she had never found any easier to contemplate. She was thinking about a woman moving briskly in a pale grey coat, from behind, in platform lighting, toward an exit. She was thinking about how very little one could actually see of a woman from behind, in platform lighting, at a distance, especially if one were already expecting to see her. People, in Miss Marple's experience, saw exactly what they had been prepared to see, and very little else. There had been a young housemaid at the vicarage some years ago, a girl named Susan, who had sworn up and down that she had seen a tall, heavily built tramp stealing the silver candlestick from the study window, largely because there had been a rash of tramps in the parish that week and a heavily built man had been mentioned repeatedly in the baker's shop. It turned out, of course, to have been the vicar's own nephew, a boy of slight build and entirely different complexion, who had simply been wearing a very large overcoat. The mind, presented with a silhouette and a strong suggestion, invariably fills in the rest of the portrait from its own expectations. A platform porter, expecting to see a woman in a grey coat, seeing a woman in a grey coat moving briskly away from him under the dim and forgiving illumination of a station at dusk, would swear in perfect good faith that he had seen the woman he was looking for. He would not stop to consider that a woman who had been practically carried onto the train 40 minutes earlier could hardly be moving with such decisive briskness now, unless a miraculous recovery had occurred. He would only see the coat. The coat was the suggestion, and the porter's helpful imagination had supplied the face. And she was thinking about the station clock at Thornbury Junction, which she had no particular reason to believe was more accurate than the station clock at Wharton Halt, or Guard Datchet's watch, and which she had every reason to wonder about. Chapter 5. Mr. Percival Crisp. The harvest supper was held on the Friday, in the village hall, a low-beamed building that smelled of old wood and new bread and the particular combination of wax candles and damp stone that characterized all gatherings of this kind. It was the sort of occasion that Wharton mead produced with the mechanical reliability of deep rural habit, the same tables, the same ladies on the committee, the same 3 men who always argued about the raffle before ultimately agreeing to run it exactly as they had run it the previous year, the same apple pies and cold beef and the vicar's wife's controversial chutney, which divided opinion annually without any sign of approaching resolution. Miss Marple liked harvest suppers very much. They compressed the village into a single room and made the observing of it straightforward. What one looked for at a harvest supper was not the extraordinary had no room to breathe in a parish hall, but the ordinary carried to its furthest point, where it became, if one watched carefully enough, something more revealing than the extraordinary ever managed to be. Percival Crisp arrived 15 minutes late, which already told Miss Marple something, and found a seat near the door, which told her something else. He was a thin-faced man, fair, with the slightly too alert expression of someone who has been in the habit of looking over his shoulder. His suit was good and not well worn. in the way of a man who keeps his Sunday suit Sunday adjacent the rest of the week. He accepted a plate of cold chicken with the vague gratitude of someone operating on automatic, and looked up and around the room with the scanning anxiety of a man hoping to locate a specific person before that person locates him. Miss Marple, situated at the far end of the hall with Mrs. Hadley and the vicar's wife, and apparently deeply absorbed in a discussion of the forthcoming Christmas fete arrangements, watched Percival Crisp with a comprehensive and entirely invisible attention. He was afraid of someone in this room. That much was obvious. But the quality of his fear was specific, it was social, not existential, it was the fear of embarrassment and confrontation rather than the fear of discovery. Every 3 minutes or so, his eyes moved to the middle left of the hall, to the table where Mrs. Winifred Fellows Barton sat with the comfortable authority of a woman who has established, over 60 years, a radius of social gravity that causes others to orbit her somewhat against their will. Mrs. Fellows Barton was a widow of recent improvement. She had been, before her husband's death, a perfectly ordinary woman of moderate opinions and moderate means, and had become since his death a woman of forthright views, expanded horizons, and a tendency to direct inquiries at people who would rather not be inquired at. When her gaze landed on Percival Crisp, which it did twice during the course of the supper, it had the quality of a woman who is owed a letter that has not arrived. Miss Marple considered Percival Crisp with the mild, sympathetic attention she gave to all human difficulty, and reached her conclusions. A man who has just committed a calculated murder does not spill his soup when a village matron looks at him severely. He may tremble for other reasons, but not that one. The guilt of violent crime has a specific internal quality that manifests in a specific external way, a stillness beneath the surface agitation, as though the person in question has been divided into two, one part performing the business of ordinary life and another part fixed in permanent, unmoving contemplation of what they have done. Percival Crisp was not divided in this way. He was entirely and uncomplicatedly afraid of Mrs. Fellows Barton, in the way that any reasonably sensitive man would be afraid of a woman to whom he had made a commitment he was now attempting to honor less than fully. It was the anxiety of a man who has failed to write a letter, or to make a visit, or to follow through on some social or romantic obligation, and who knows that the woman in question is not going to let the matter pass. This had, Miss Marple thought, absolutely nothing to do with Mrs. Evelyn Keene, who by all accounts Percival Crisp had met perhaps 4 times in his life and owed money to, which was an entirely separate form of anxiety and one she had not seen on his face at all. She said to Mrs. Hadley, as they walked home through the cold dark lane, that she did not believe Mr. Crisp had given Mrs. Keene a thought since her death. Mrs. Hadley said, "My dear, what do you mean?" Miss Marple said that his terror was domestic, not criminal, and that Inspector Radstock would do better to look at the family rather than the creditor. Mrs. Hadley said, "Ah," and seemed to be turning this over. Chapter 6. What the Timetable Could Not Say. The fire had sunk to embers and the house was completely quiet. Mrs. Hadley's grandfather clock in the hall struck 11 with the deep, brass certainty of a clock that has been right for 40 years and knows it. Outside, the November wind had picked up and was working at the window frames in an exploratory way, testing the putty. Mrs. Hadley had gone to bed at 10, and Miss Marple had said she would follow shortly, which was not entirely true. She sat in the armchair by the cooling grate with a railway timetable borrowed from the bureau drawer, a notepad on her knee, and her knitting set aside for once in favor of a pencil. She was doing arithmetic. The departure from Wharton Halt. By the station clock, for 22. By her own watch, for 23. By guard Datchet's record, for 15. The discrepancy, 7 minutes. Datchet had not lied. Datchet was not the lying sort. His watch ran 7 minutes slow, and he had been running 11 years by it, and he had recorded, with perfect sincerity, a time that was 7 minutes wrong throughout. The arrival at Paddington, 6:28 by the timetable, the body examined shortly after. The pathologist's estimate, which Radstock had mentioned, with the casualness of someone inserting a technical detail into a larger theory, was that death had occurred between 50 and 70 minutes before the examination at 6:30, which placed death between 4:20 and 6:20. That window, taken at face value, contained the entire journey. But Miss Marple was not interested in the window taken at face value. She was interested in atropine. Radstock had mentioned it as something found in the post-mortem, a trace of atropine in the blood, consistent with medicinal use, which the pathologist had flagged without comment, because the Ashbourne family doctor, when contacted, had confirmed that Mrs. Keene had no prescription for any atropine preparation. The detail had been filed. It had not, as far as Miss Marple could tell, been acted upon. Miss Marple had known 2 people in her life who had been exposed to atropine in medicinal doses, and she knew its character. At first, there was a terrible thirst, and a flushing of the skin, and a slight confusion. Then a deepening lethargy. Then, within 40 minutes of a significant dose, something very close to complete unconsciousness. The pulse continued. The breathing continued. But the person was, to all practical intents, absent, existing in a state that would look, to a railway guard glancing through compartment glass at a woman against the window, very much like sleep. There had been, back in St. Mary Mead, a retired colonel named Symes who maintained a garden of considerable ambition and employed a gardener named Noakes of considerable reliability. Noakes arrived every weekday at 8 o'clock precisely, a fact that the colonel noted with approval on approximately a daily basis. He had been noting it for 22 years. When the new vicar, a vigorous young man with strong opinions about both theology and horology, had the village clock corrected against the BBC time signal, advancing it by 5 minutes to bring it into conformity with Greenwich, no one had thought to inform old Noakes, who had been setting his watch by the church clock every Sunday morning since he began the job. Noakes continued to arrive at what his watch read as 8 o'clock, which was in fact, for a period of some 3 months, 7:55. He was, by his own understanding of the matter, perfectly punctual. The colonel was obscurely delighted. Nobody could quite explain why, because nobody had noticed. His truth and the actual time had quietly, invisibly parted company, and he had not the slightest awareness of it. Miss Marple set down her pencil. Guard Datchet had seen a woman apparently asleep in a first-class compartment. He had seen this at 4:29 by the actual time, not 4:22, which was what the station clock said, and certainly not 4:15, which was what his ledger said. At 4:29, a woman who had consumed a significant dose of atropine 40 minutes earlier, since, say, 3:45, when she and a companion might have settled in the tea room and ordered tea, would be profoundly unconscious. Her pulse would be present. Her breathing would be shallow but observable. She would look, through compartment glass, to a conscientious guard who was quite certain nothing was wrong, very much like a woman resting with a headache. The murder had not occurred on the train. The murder had occurred before the train left the station. And Dorothea Ashbourne had not boarded the 4:15. She had placed a dying woman in first class, arranged her with the appearance of comfortable rest, and walked away. Chapter 7: A Cup of Something Warm. The station tea-room was quiet at 10:30 in the morning, which was the time Miss Marple chose to visit, for no reason she would have admitted to any policeman and for every reason she would have been able to explain afterward. Ellen Tripp was wiping the counter with the steady, circular rhythm of a woman who has been wiping counters since before Miss Marple was knitting, and she looked up with the uncomplicated friendliness of a person who has nothing to conceal. "Tea," she said. "Please," said Miss Marple, and settled at the corner table by the frosted window, the corner table, the one with 2 chairs, the one that had had 2 teacups on it the previous Monday afternoon. They talked about the weather, which was still unreasonably cold, and about the harvest supper, which Ellen had attended in the capacity of having brought 24 jam tarts, and about the murder, which everybody in Wharton Halt had an opinion on. Ellen Tripp's opinion was that it was dreadful, and that she felt terrible about it, because she had seen the poor woman looking so poorly and had thought no more of it, and if she'd only said something. "You saw her that afternoon?" Miss Marple said. "Here?" "Here, yes. The 2 of them. The dark lady, Mrs. Ashbourne, they're saying she came in first, perhaps 20 minutes before the 4:15. Then the other one, Mrs. Keene, the one who died, she came 5 minutes after. I thought it was funny they didn't come in together, but perhaps they'd come separately to the station, I thought. They sat at this table." She patted the surface of it with her cloth. "They had a pot of tea. They talked, quietly, I couldn't hear, and the darker one, Mrs. Ashbourne, she was perfectly well. Cheerful, almost. But Mrs. Keene," Ellen stopped, shook her head. "She went off in about 10 minutes. Started looking pale. Put her hand to her forehead. I thought migraine. You can always tell a migraine, there's a particular way people go still when the lights start to bother them." "And the tea?" Miss Marple said. Ellen thought back carefully, frowning with the effort of accurate memory. The first cup she drank quite normally. Mrs. Ashbourne poured the second. She was very attentive, kept fussing, put 2 sugars in without being asked, which I noticed because she'd been very particular about no sugar in her own. Then Mrs. Keene just didn't drink it. Didn't lift it. Sat there with her hand over her eyes. The cup was full when I cleared the table afterward. And Mrs. Ashbourne paid. Paid and gave a very nice tip. Asked me whether the first-class compartments were comfortable for someone with a head. Said her sister-in-law needed to lie down and she wanted to make sure she'd be all right. I said I was sure they were very comfortable. Then she helped her up, practically had to carry her, to be honest, though I thought that was the migraine, and they went. Ellen paused. I should have said something, shouldn't I? If I'd known. You couldn't have known, Miss Marple said gently. You did nothing wrong. You were very kind to think of the first-class comfort. She finished her tea. One more thing. Mrs. Ashbourne, when she helped Mrs. Keene up, did she take anything from the table? Any items? A bag, perhaps, or a coat? Ellen thought. She picked up a grey coat that was over the back of Mrs. Keene's chair, she said slowly. Folded it over her arm. I thought she was carrying it for her because she was feeling ill. Miss Marple thanked her, paid for the tea, and left a very nice tip. She walked back to Mrs. Hadley's cottage through the cold morning with the final piece of the thing quite clear in her mind. Dorothea had taken the grey coat from the tea-room. She had put it on at some point, in the ladies', perhaps, or in the compartment, travelled to Thornbury wearing it, disembarked in full view of the platform porter who was expecting, if he was looking at all, to see a woman in a grey coat, and walked away. She had committed a murder in a railway tea-room and provided herself a witness at Thornbury Junction, and the entire mechanism had depended on a single man's unwavering confidence in a watch that he had never once compared to the station clock it was meant to match. Chapter 8. 7 minutes. The frost had come in earnest overnight, leaving the village road silver and the puddles in the lane glassy and opaque. Inspector Radstock received Miss Marple in his office on the Friday morning with an expression that suggested he was doing so as a courtesy to Mrs. Hadley rather than in any expectation of being told something useful. His office smelled of cold pipe tobacco and manila folders, and the window looked out on the back of the butcher's and the beginning of the churchyard wall, both of which were currently white with frost and equally uninformative. He offered her a chair. He did not offer her tea, which she took as a reasonable indication of his mood. He folded his hands on his desk and prepared, with visible patience, to hear her out. She did not hurry. She set out the arithmetic first, the station clock, her own watch, Datchet's ledger, and she watched his face as the 7 minutes established themselves and their implications began to accumulate. The train departed at 4:22, she said. Not for 15. Datchet is a perfectly honest man. He has simply been living by a watch that runs 7 minutes slow, and he has been recording for 15 for 11 years when the actual time has been for 22, and this has been, from a railway operating perspective, of no consequence whatever. Until now. She paused to let this settle. The consequence is this: every time in Datchet's ledger for that afternoon runs 7 minutes slow. When he records that he checked the compartments and found the woman alive, the actual time is 7 minutes later than the recorded time. Which means his observation occurred at 4:29, not 4:22. Radstock said, 7 minutes doesn't change the impossibility of. It changes the tea-room, Miss Marple said, very gently. The two women sat together just before 4 o'clock, and Mrs. Keene drank her first cup of tea. She began to show symptoms consistent with atropine poisoning approximately 10 to 15 minutes later. The receipt was timed at 4:15. If she was given a significant dose in that first cup, by the time Datchet checked the compartment at 4:29, by actual time, the drug would have had ample time to take full effect. She would have been deeply unconscious. Not sleeping. Unconscious. The difference, through compartment glass, in the failing October light, would have been entirely invisible. She watched him absorb this. She could see the moment it became real to him, the slight tightening around the eyes, the stillness of a man who is rearranging a picture. The murder occurred in the tea room, she said. Atropine, administered in the first cup of tea by Dorothea Ashbourne. Mrs. Keene drank the first cup. She did not touch the second. By the time the second was poured, she could not lift it. Dorothea helped her, with great visible solicitude, along the platform and into first class. She spoke to the porter about migraines. She arranged the compartment rug. And then she left. She did not board the train. Then who was seen at Thornbury? Radstock said. He was resistant still, but the resistance was becoming the resistance of a man checking his own arithmetic rather than disputing hers. Dorothea was seen at Thornbury. She was wearing Mrs. Keene's grey coat, which she had taken from the tea room. She travelled with the body from Wharton Halt to Thornbury, that is roughly 40 minutes, ensuring the compartment was not disturbed, presenting to any glance through the glass the appearance of a woman asleep beside her travelling companion. At Thornbury, she disembarked wearing the grey coat, walked briskly toward the exit as the porter watched, disposed of the coat, in a luggage room, a litter bin, a left luggage office, it does not matter, and made her own way home. She had arranged a car, presumably, or boarded a later service to a junction from which she could reach home without passing through Wharton Halt. And the motive, Radstock said, almost quietly. Gerald Ashbourne's financial situation is severe. Mrs. Keene's death releases to him, a surviving sibling, a considerable sum from their father's estate, an income from a trust, and the proceeds of a life insurance policy on which he is the named beneficiary. His prescription for atropine eye drops, the repeat prescription, collected 4 monthly from the village dispensary, would provide the means. The dispensary will have records. The most recent collection date would be instructive. Radstock picked up his telephone. Miss Marple thanked him for his time, gathered her bag, and went back to Mrs. Hadley's to have luncheon and a quiet afternoon with her knitting. Chapter 9: The Last Train. She was not present when the police cars went up the drive at Ashbourne Grange, though she heard about it from Mrs. Hadley, who heard it from Mrs. Coombs at the post office, who had it from the constable's wife before 10 in the morning. The arrest, Mrs. Hadley said, had been brief and extraordinarily quiet. Dorothea had come to the door herself, which nobody had expected, and had said, without preamble, that she had been expecting them, which was either remarkable self-possession or its own kind of confession. Gerald had been in the study. He had apparently not come to the door at all, but had remained at his desk, and when the constable appeared in the doorway he had looked up in the manner of a man interrupted at paperwork, and had said only, "Give me 5 minutes," and had then sat for the full 5 minutes doing nothing visible at all, and then had stood up and gone with them without a word. She was in the garden at the time, in the thin November sunshine, listening to the robin that had taken up residence in the far hedge and was spending the afternoon in a sustained and evidently satisfying monologue. The apple trees had lost their leaves entirely. The air smelled of bonfires and turned earth. It was, Miss Marple thought, a perfectly ordinary autumn garden, and she was glad to be in it. She saw Gerald Ashbourne only once more, and it was by chance, in the waiting room of Mr. Fellows the solicitor, where she had gone to witness a document for Mrs. Hadley. He was sitting by the window with his hands folded in his lap, flanked at a discreet distance by two quiet men in plain clothes who had the practised inconspicuousness of people who sit and wait for a living. He had lost the quality Mrs. Hadley had so often described in him, the controlled solidity of a local squire, the slightly effortful composure of a man holding together a crumbling inheritance and a desperate secret. What was left was something simpler and, in its way, less terrible, a man who was very tired and who no longer needed to maintain his performance. When she came in and settled herself on the opposite bench and opened her bag for her knitting, he looked up. Their eyes met for a moment. She gave him a small nod, unhurried, and looked away, and said nothing, and he said nothing, and they sat in the quiet room for 12 minutes before the solicitor's clerk came out. Mrs. Hadley told her, over tea that evening, with the careful economy of someone who has been told a great many things in rapid succession and is condensing them into their essential shape, that Dorothea had broken within the first hour of Radstock's interview. The dispensary records had been telephoned for. The grey coat, it emerged, had been found by a station cleaner in the Thornbury Junction ladies' waiting room late on the Monday evening and handed into the station master's office, from which the police had retrieved it the day after, without at that point knowing what they had. When Radstock placed the tea-room receipt and the dispensary record and the coat, all three, on the table before Dorothea, she had looked at them for a moment, and then looked at Radstock, and then said, in a very controlled voice, that she would like to say that it had been Gerald's plan entirely and that she had not known what was in the cup until it was too late. Which was not, Radstock later told the constable, anything like what the evidence showed, but it had the advantage of being Dorothea's truth, which was the only truth she had available. Gerald, by all accounts, had said very little. He had looked at the evidence. He had asked for his solicitor. He had sat down and folded his hands in his lap and, so the constable reported, not moved for a considerable time. The village, by the following week, had achieved that particular state of communal digestion that follows upon a large and scandalous event, the immediate excitement exhausted, the secondary opinions all exchanged, the tertiary discussion of motives and morality well underway. At the post office, the Ashbourne name was attached to several new and elaborate theories about the history of the Grange, the old Mr. Ashbourne's finances, and the likelihood or otherwise of there being more to the affair than had yet emerged. Miss Marple, visiting Mrs. Hadley's neighbours on a small errand, listened to several of these theories with attention and found them, on balance, less interesting than the truth, which was often the case. A week later, on a cold and perfectly clear Thursday morning, Miss Marple stood on platform 2 of Wharton Halt with her bags neatly beside her and watched the smoke from the signal box drifting sideways in the light northwest wind. The village had returned, in the way of villages, to its ordinary business. The elm trees were bare. The station clock above the ticket office read 9:14, its black hands precise and authoritative against the white face. At the far end of the platform, Guard Datchet was performing his pre-departure rounds with undiminished ceremony. He walked the platform, he straightened his cap, he produced his watch, the solid, honest, 7-minute slow watch, and he checked it against his personal understanding of the time, and he nodded to himself with complete satisfaction. He would record the departure as 9:15. The train would leave at 9:22. It was curious, she thought, how completely a man could inhabit a system that was simply wrong, and find it entirely sufficient. Datchet's watch had been running 7 minutes slow for, she suspected, considerably longer than the 11 years of his present posting. It had probably been slow when he bought it. He had wound it every morning with the same devoted hand, and it had rewarded him with the same devoted inaccuracy, and neither of them had noticed, and the railway had not noticed, because 7 minutes on a rural branch line was within the margin of ordinary variation, and the whole system had simply adjusted itself around him, passengers arriving a few minutes early, trains appearing to depart on time, and everything proceeding with the harmonious imprecision of an arrangement that has never been tested against reality. Until the moment it had been. And then it had mattered enormously. Miss Marple, watching him, felt the particular small tenderness she reserved for the world's sincere certainties. She would not tell him about the watch. It was not the sort of information that served any purpose, and in any case he had been perfectly happy with it for 11 years, and the railway had been perfectly satisfied with him, and the only difficulty had been a murder built upon it, which was an unusual order of difficulty, and now quite resolved. She thought she would send a note to Dr. Mead suggesting that the dispensary consider a small review of its collection procedures for prescription medications, and she thought she would ask Mrs. Hadley to recommend her to the Women's Institute Committee, which was always more useful than it sounded, and she thought she would have a very good cup of tea on the train. She also thought, as she watched Datchet complete his final platform inspection with the satisfied bearing of a man whose record remains unblemished and whose watch is, as always, perfectly right, that there was something genuinely admirable about a man who simply did his job with complete conscientiousness every single day, and that this admirable quality had been, in this particular case, borrowed without his knowledge and put to the worst possible use, which was perhaps the most interesting thing about the whole affair from a human nature perspective, and certainly the most unsettling. The 4:15, or more precisely, the 9:15, which would depart at 9:22, came in, and Miss Marple boarded it, and found her seat, and picked up her knitting, and watched the October countryside give way to November countryside give way to the outskirts of things, and thought, with her particular form of quiet contentment, that it really was extraordinary what a small mechanical flaw could do, if someone happened to be paying attention. And there we have it, friends, a murder built on 7 minutes, on the absolute faith we place in a conscientious man's pocket watch, and on the one detail that everyone looked at and nobody saw. There is something in this, I think, about the danger of certainty, about how thoroughly we trust the things that have never yet been wrong. Guard Datchet was an honest man. He simply didn't know his watch was slow. And in that small, invisible gap between his time and the world's time, two people thought they had built the perfect crime. Thank you for spending this evening at Midnight Pages. If tonight's story kept you company, I would be very glad to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me the moment you worked it out, if you did, or tell me the detail that threw you. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Every listener is welcome here, and we always have another mystery waiting. Until next time, I'm Jack, and I'll see you in the next story. Good night.